The palace grounds were quiet that early spring morning. A soft layer of fog rested over the royal gardens, wrapping the old stone walls like a veil. Birds perched on the tall iron gates, their gentle chirping echoing through the cold air. For many years, mornings like this had always begun the same way, carefully, silently, with a certain kind of respect for the history that lived inside those walls. But on this day, something felt different. There was a stillness in the air, a feeling as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Camilla walked down the marble hallway with her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had spent nearly half her life inside this palace, not as royalty but as someone trusted to be close to it. She knew the sound of the guards changing shifts before sunrise. She could tell by the way the curtains moved which window the queen liked to open first each morning. She had memorized the steps that creaked, the ones that didn't, and the rooms where even whispers felt too loud. For years, Camilla had carried herself with grace. The late queen had trusted her deeply. People around the palace spoke of Camilla as a woman of quiet strength, someone who never asked for more than what she was given. She was not a servant, but she was not royal either. She lived in the space between those two worlds, a position that gave her both privilege and responsibility. As she passed the portraits of past rulers, she paused for a moment before one painting of the late queen. The woman in the portrait wore a soft blue gown, a pearl necklace resting just below her collarbone. Her smile was gentle, almost alive. Camilla's chest felt heavy. She remembered the way the queen had spoken to her, not like a distant monarch, but like a friend. Loyalty is quiet, the queen used to say, but it speaks louder than gold. The queen had passed away only months ago, but the palace still felt like it belonged to her. Every corner, every hallway, every vase of white lilies reminded everyone of her quiet rule. And while the rest of the world moved forward inside these walls, time felt slower, like the palace was trying to hold on to the memory of its beloved queen. Camilla's son, Adrian, joined her at the far end of the hallway. He was in his late 20s, tall and confident, with the kind of ease that came from growing up surrounded by wealth he did not own. He had spent his childhood in these same gardens, climbing trees near the guard tower, racing through the rose maze when no one was looking. Unlike his mother, Adrian had never learned the weight of silence in a palace. He saw the world as a place to be explored, not tiptoed around. "Morning, Mother," he said softly, his voice breaking the still air. Camilla nodded, giving him a small smile. "You're early." "I couldn't sleep," Adrian replied. "Too quiet." Camilla looked at him carefully. "This place has always been quiet. You just notice it more now." Since the queen's passing, the rhythm of palace life had changed. Many of the queen's trusted people had been reassigned or quietly let go. Camilla had been allowed to stay because of her long service and the bond she had with the royal family. Adrian had also remained, though he had no official role. Some whispered that he was only still there because of his mother. The royal guard passed by them in their crisp uniforms. Their boots clicked against the polished floor, their posture straight as arrows. Their presence was a constant reminder that while the palace might feel like a home to some, it was first and foremost a fortress, a place that belonged not to individuals, but to history. Camilla watched the guards and felt a faint chill. The royal guard answered to no one but the crown. Even the most trusted members of the household knew better than to test their authority. They were not cruel, but they were firm, and they protected the legacy of the monarchy as if it were made of glass. Precious, fragile, and never to be touched carelessly. A maid passed by, offering a polite bow before hurrying down the hall. Everyone still moved carefully in the weeks after the queen's funeral. People spoke softly, lowered their heads more than usual, and tried to avoid doing anything that might be seen as disrespectful. For Camilla, it was a strange in-between time. She was surrounded by history, but unsure of her place in it. She thought back to the first day she entered the palace almost 2 decades earlier. She had been young then, nervous but determined. She was given a small room on the east wing, close enough to be near the royal household but far enough to understand she wasn't one of them. Over time, she earned trust. She was invited to private dinners, included in seasonal celebrations, even mentioned in the Queen's holiday addresses to staff. To many, Camilla was more than an employee. She was part of the royal story. Adrian, however, saw things differently. As they walked toward the gardens, his eyes drifted to the tall golden frames, the polished chandeliers, and the long red carpets that stretched endlessly down the corridors. He had grown up surrounded by luxury, but it was not his. That invisible line between belonging and being allowed had always been clear, and over time it quietly irritated him. He loved the palace, but part of him felt like a guest who had stayed too long. "You ever wonder," he began, looking at the portraits, "what it would feel like to actually be one of them?" Camilla gave him a sharp but gentle look. "We were trusted here, Adrian. That is something few people have." "That is enough," he shrugged. "I guess. But they're gone now." "Things are different," she didn't answer, but deep down she knew he was right. Since the Queen's passing, everything felt uncertain. The new leadership wasn't as close to her. Policies were changing, faces were changing, and the feeling of belonging was fading. Camilla slowed her steps as they entered the royal garden. Dew still covered the rose bushes. Statues of past rulers stood tall, their stone faces serious and watchful. This was the Queen's favorite place. Camilla had walked these paths with her many times, listening to her stories about the kingdom, about the meaning of loyalty, about the quiet sacrifices no one ever saw. It was in this very garden that the Queen had once placed a hand on Camilla's shoulder and said, "I trust you as I trust my own reflection." Those words had stayed with her all these years, glowing like a small lamp in her heart. But now that lamp was flickering. As Camilla stood there, she felt a strange uneasiness, an emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It was more like standing on the edge of something she couldn't see yet. A sense that life inside the palace was about to change in a way she could not control. From the far corner of the garden, a guard approached quietly. He stopped a few feet away and gave a formal bow. "Madam Camilla," he said, his tone polite but firm, "a small meeting has been arranged this evening. You and your son are expected to be present." Camilla's brows furrowed. "A meeting? About what?" The guard shook his head. "I am only to deliver the message." She nodded slowly, but something inside her tightened. Meetings like this did not happen without reason, and when the royal guard was involved, it was never something small. Adrian noticed her uneasiness. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said softly, though the word didn't sound convincing even to her own ears. It's probably just formalities, but she knew better. In a place like this, nothing was ever just formalities. The day moved slowly, with every tick of the old palace clock echoing louder than usual. Servants whispered quietly in corners. Guards walked their rounds with their usual precision, and yet everything felt wrapped in a layer of quiet tension. Camilla went about her usual duties, checking the storerooms, greeting familiar faces, keeping her voice calm. But underneath her composed exterior, thoughts raced. She remembered the way the Queen had always trusted her with sensitive matters, important documents, personal belongings, and sometimes even secrets no one else knew. That trust had been a kind of crown she wore in silence, and now with the Queen gone, that same trust felt like a weight she had to carry alone. As evening approached, the sky over the palace turned a soft gold. The chandeliers inside the main hall were lit, casting warm reflections on the marble floors. Camilla adjusted her dark dress and smoothed her hair, while Adrian tugged at the collar of his shirt, impatient. "You're nervous," Adrian said quietly. Camilla forced a smile. "I've lived in this palace long enough to know when something important is coming." When they entered the meeting room, several members of the royal guard were already present. Their faces were calm but unreadable. The captain stood at the far end, hands behind his back, his uniform crisp and decorated with gold buttons. His presence alone carried authority. The way the guards looked at them, respectful but distant, made the air in the room feel heavier. Camilla's heartbeat quickened, though she stood tall. This palace had been her world for so long. She could not imagine it without her in it. Adrian, on the other hand, looked curious, almost eager to understand what was happening. The captain of the guard gave a small nod. "Thank you for coming," he said. And in that moment, Camilla knew. The quiet days she had once taken for granted were ending. The meeting room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect or peace. It was the kind of silence that made hearts beat a little faster, and made even the softest sound echo louder than it should. Camilla stood beside her son Adrian, her hands folded tightly together. The royal guard members stood around the room, their faces calm but serious. Every pair of eyes seemed to hold a quiet question, one she didn't yet understand. The captain of the Royal Guard stepped forward. He was an older man with silver streaks in his dark hair and eyes that had seen many years of palace history. His uniform was pressed perfectly, every metal polished until it shined in the warm light of the chandelier above. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "Camilla, Adrian, thank you for coming." Camilla gave a small nod. Her voice felt trapped in her throat. Adrian shifted slightly, uncomfortable but trying not to show it. He had never liked formal gatherings like this. He was used to the gardens, the laughter of friends, the sense of freedom around the palace. But this room had no warmth, only rules. The captain continued. "This palace has always valued loyalty. It has always trusted those who serve within its walls. That trust is what keeps this place strong, even when the world outside changes." Camilla felt a strange twist in her stomach. Whenever people started talking about trust, it usually meant something important was about to be said. She glanced at Adrian. He raised an eyebrow, silently asking if she understood what was happening. She didn't. The captain picked up a small folder from the table in front of him. It was made of fine leather, the kind used only for official matters. He opened it slowly. Inside were several papers and photographs. "In recent weeks," he said, "a few items from the late Queen's private collection have been found missing." Camilla's breath caught. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The late Queen's belongings were not just objects. They were pieces of history. Everything inside that collection was precious, not just because of its value, but because of what it represented. The Queen had always cared deeply about those items. She had once told Camilla that each piece had a story, a memory, a moment of her life attached to it. The captain's voice grew quieter, but sharper. These items were last seen in the private storage wing. Only a few people had access. People who were trusted. The word trusted felt heavy in the air. Camilla's heart pounded. She had walked through that storage wing many times in her years of service. She had carried some of those boxes with her own hands. She knew how carefully everything was counted, how every single object was logged and checked. Losing anything from that place was almost unthinkable. Adrian frowned slightly. "And what does that have to do with us?" The captain looked directly at him. His eyes did not move away. "Everything." The room seemed to grow colder, though nothing had changed. A faint sound of footsteps outside the hallway echoed, but inside it was still as stone. The captain laid a few photographs on the table. From where Camilla stood, she could see a close-up image of one of the Queen's favorite brooches. A delicate piece decorated with pearls and small diamonds. She remembered how the Queen used to wear it on special occasions. She remembered how carefully it was placed back into its box every time. "These were recovered," the captain said slowly, "from a private auction house overseas." Camilla's head felt light. "Overseas?" she whispered. "That can't be right." The captain looked at her with the same calm, steady expression. "The auction house provided documents. These items were sold quietly through private channels. And the person who handled the sale used credentials that matched the access belonging to you and your son." Camilla took a step back as if the air itself had pushed her. No, that's not possible. There must be a mistake." Adrian straightened his shoulders, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "This is ridiculous. We didn't take anything." But the captain didn't respond to his protest. He simply placed another piece of paper on the table. This time it was a printed record. Signatures, dates, and a security log that showed the exact time when the storage wing was entered. The access badge number was listed clearly. Camilla recognized the number immediately. It was hers. She felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't entered the storage wing at that time. She was sure of it. She had always been careful with her badge. She looked at Adrian, her eyes wide with silent questions. He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Camilla," the captain said gently but firmly, "you have been here longer than almost anyone. You know how seriously we take matters of the Queen's legacy. I need to ask you directly. Did you authorize the removal of any items?" Her head shook quickly. "No, never. I would never do that." "You know me." For a brief second, the captain's eyes softened. He did know her. He had seen her serve for years with quiet loyalty, but his duty was clear. "The evidence tells a different story." Adrian stepped forward. "What kind of evidence?" "Anyone could have taken those things. There are dozens of people with access." "Not quite," one of the guards replied calmly. Only 3 people had the level of clearance required. You, your mother, and the late Queen's personal archivist. The archivist is currently abroad on official leave and was not present during the time of removal. The security system confirms this. The captain closed the folder slowly, almost respectfully. This isn't just about missing objects. It's about trust. The Queen's belongings are more than history. They are a part of the nation's identity. And someone has broken that trust. Camilla felt as if the room had closed in around her. She wanted to speak, to shout, to explain, but words wouldn't come. She had spent half her life earning this trust. The idea that anyone would believe she could betray it made her chest ache. Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. He tried to look calm, but his jaw was tight. "So what happens now?" he asked. "For now," the captain said, "we ask questions. We find answers. If there has been a misunderstanding, we will find it. But until then, you are both expected to remain inside the palace grounds. You may not leave without clearance." Camilla's voice finally returned. "Captain, I have nothing to hide. I want the truth to come out as much as you do." He gave her a slow nod. "Then you'll cooperate with the investigation." She nodded, even though her hands were trembling slightly. She had never been on this side of the conversation before. She had always been one of the trusted, never the questioned. As they left the meeting room, the palace felt different. It wasn't the warm, familiar place it had been that morning. The halls seemed longer. The portraits seemed to watch them silently. The guard's footsteps echoed behind them, not threatening, but heavy. Adrian walked beside his mother quietly. For once, he didn't make jokes or speak carelessly. There was a tension in his shoulders. "Mother," he said finally, "this is serious." "I know," Camilla whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the sound of their shoes on the floor. "I just don't understand how this happened. Do you think someone used your badge?" Adrian asked. "It's possible," she said. "But why? Who would do that? And why us?" Neither of them had answers. As the day went on, whispers began to spread quietly through the palace. Staff spoke to each other in low tones in corners of the hallway. Everyone knew something was happening, even if they didn't know the full story. The royal guard was asking questions. That alone was enough to make people uneasy. In a place where appearances mattered more than anything, suspicion was like a shadow that followed you everywhere. Camilla tried to go about her duties as usual. She checked the linen storerooms. She walked through the east corridor. She spoke politely to the people she'd known for years. But she could feel their eyes on her, just a little longer than usual. Their smiles were polite but not warm. Doubt had entered the air, and once doubt entered, it never left easily. Adrian spent the afternoon in the courtyard, pacing. He wasn't good at silence. He had always been restless, always craving a sense of control. But now everything felt uncertain. He thought about the captain's words, the documents, the badge number. He thought about how easily everything could change. For the first time in a long time, Adrian realized how fragile their place in this world really was. They had lived among royalty, but they were not royalty. Their stay in this palace had always depended on trust, and trust, once broken, could not easily be repaired. That evening, the sun set slowly behind the palace towers. The sky turned a soft gold, then pink, then a quiet shade of blue. Camilla stood at the window of her small apartment in the east wing, looking out at the gardens. She remembered the Queen's smile, her gentle voice, her words about loyalty. She had always believed that as long as she stayed honest, she would always have a place here. But now everything was uncertain. Adrian entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "What if they don't believe us?" he asked. Camilla turned toward him slowly. She didn't have a clear answer. "Then we make them believe," she said softly. "Because the truth has to be stronger than suspicion." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. The world inside the palace was not always fair, and trust, once questioned, was hard to win back. Outside, the royal guard changed shifts again. Their movements were calm and organized as always. But tonight their presence felt different. This was no longer just another evening. This was the beginning of something neither Camilla nor. The next morning arrived quietly, but the palace did not feel the same. The golden rays of the early sun touched the white stone walls. The birds chirped softly in the royal garden, and the fountain continued to flow gently. On the surface, everything seemed peaceful, just like any other day. But behind those calm walls, something invisible was spreading. Whispers. People walked through the hallways with lowered voices. The kitchen staff spoke in corners. The housekeepers exchanged looks they did not dare explain aloud. The guards, usually quiet and expressionless, now seemed to observe everything more closely. The disappearance of the Queen's belongings was no longer a small issue. It was becoming the center of quiet discussions all across the palace. Camilla stepped out of her room with careful steps. Her long years in the palace had taught her to read the atmosphere, and this morning she felt it clearly. People were no longer looking at her with the same trust they once had. Their smiles were polite but distant. Some avoided her eyes completely. That silent distance was more painful than any harsh word could ever be. She walked down the east corridor toward the main hall, where she usually began her day's work. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble floor. She had spent decades building a life of trust here. Now it felt like she was walking through a place that no longer belonged to her. Adrian followed a few steps behind, his hands in his pockets. He looked around as if seeing the palace differently for the first time. "They're staring," he whispered. Camilla didn't turn to him. "They're whispering," she replied quietly. "There's a difference." "They don't believe us," Adrian said, frowning slightly. "People believe what they hear the most," Camilla answered gently. "Right now they are hearing only one story, the one they've been told. Not the truth." Adrian looked around again. It was hard to see the place he'd grown up in change like this. It wasn't just the walls. It was the way people walked, the way they avoided him, the way they spoke softly as he passed. As they entered the main hall, they saw a group of royal guards speaking in low voices near the staircase. The captain wasn't there, but the presence of so many guards in one place was enough to make the air heavier. Camilla and Adrian slowed their pace without meaning to. "Camilla," a familiar voice called softly. It was Clara, a maid who had worked with her for over 15 years. She approached carefully, glancing around before speaking. "I heard they're checking everyone's movements from that night. Every hallway. Every door." Camilla gave a small nod. "They should," she replied calmly. "If they look carefully, they will find the truth." Clara hesitated before speaking again. "Some people are saying they saw someone near the storage wing, late at night. But they don't know who." Camilla's heart skipped slightly. "Who said that?" Clara lowered her eyes. "I don't know exactly. It's just what people are whispering." Adrian folded his arms. "Then we need to find out who really went there. If we don't, they'll just keep pointing at us." Camilla knew he was right, but finding the truth inside the palace was not simple. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. People rarely said what they really knew. In a place built on tradition and silence, secrets were kept carefully. She thanked Clara and walked on, deep in thought. As she passed through the hallway, she saw one of the security panels near the wall. It was small and almost hidden, but Camilla knew what it was. It stored the entry and exit logs for the palace's restricted areas. She had walked past it hundreds of times before without a second thought. But today it felt different. "Mother," Adrian whispered, following her eyes. "That's where they'll find out who used your badge, right?" "Yes," she replied softly. "Every step in this palace leaves a shadow, Adrian. We just need to follow the shadow." But they could not access that system directly. Only the royal guard could. Camilla knew the rules better than anyone. She couldn't just walk in and demand information. Still, if she wanted to prove her innocence, she needed to find a way. Later in the day, the captain requested to speak with her again. She walked to his office, a tall, quiet room with a large window overlooking the gardens. His desk was simple, not cluttered, everything in order. That was the way he worked, carefully, without hurry, but without hesitation. "Camilla," he said as she entered, gesturing for her to sit. "I have some updates." She sat slowly, keeping her posture straight. "Yes, Captain?" He looked down at a few papers in front of him. "We've reviewed the logs. Your badge was used at 10:43 p.m. On the night the items disappeared. You were recorded leaving the East Wing earlier that evening. But the security camera in the storage corridor, strangely, has no recording for that hour." It was briefly offline. Camilla's eyes widened slightly. "Offline? How is that possible?" "That system never fails." The captain's gaze was firm but not harsh. "It doesn't. Which means it was turned off." Camilla felt her breath catch. She would never touch the camera system. She didn't even know how. You've been here for a long time, the captain continued. I want to believe you. But this is not something we can ignore. Someone used your badge and they knew exactly what they were doing. Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke clearly. Captain, I didn't take anything. I swear it. Someone used my badge. Someone who planned this. He leaned back in his chair and watched her quietly for a moment. If that's true, Camilla, then we must find out who. But this investigation is delicate. You and your son should avoid moving freely around the palace for now. It is for your own protection, too. Her heart sank a little. For years, she had walked freely through every corner of the palace. Now she was being told where she could and couldn't go. It wasn't a punishment yet, but it felt like the beginning of something she couldn't stop. When she left the captain's office, Adrian was waiting for her in the corridor. He looked at her face and immediately knew something had happened. What did he say? He asked quickly. She told him everything. The time, the camera, the system being turned off. Adrian's eyes narrowed as he listened. Someone planned this carefully, he said. They knew when to use your badge. They knew how to avoid the cameras. They wanted it to look like it was you. Camilla nodded slowly. Yes, but the question is who? The next few days moved slowly, but the whispers grew louder. People in the palace liked stories, and when they didn't have the whole truth, they created their own. Some said Camilla had secretly wanted the queen's jewelry. Others said Adrian was trying to sell something to live outside the palace. None of it was true, but gossip never needed proof to grow. Camilla stayed calm even when people spoke behind her. She had learned long ago that defending yourself against every whisper only made them louder. Instead, she focused on finding something real, something that could clear their names. One night, as the halls grew quiet, Adrian came to her room with a determined look on his face. Mother, he said in a low voice, I've been thinking. Whoever did this knew everything. The exact time. The way to avoid the camera. That means it's someone who works here, someone who understands the system. Camilla nodded slowly. Yes, I believe so too. I might know where to look, Adrian added. When I was younger, I used to sneak around with some of the other staff kids. We used to see how the night staff moved. There are places where guards switch positions, gaps. If someone wanted to sneak in without being seen, they'd use those gaps. Camilla looked at him with a mix of worry and hope. Adrian, this is not a game anymore. I know, he said seriously, but this is our only chance. If we don't find out who did this, they'll blame us, and we'll lose everything. Camilla sat back and thought carefully. She'd spent most of her life following rules, but now the rules themselves seemed to be turning against her. If they were going to clear their names, they needed more than patience. They needed answers. The following evening, when most of the palace had gone quiet, Camilla and Adrian walked carefully through the lower hallway near the storage wing. The lamps cast soft shadows on the floor and their footsteps sounded louder than usual. They moved slowly, listening carefully for every sound. This is the corner where the camera was off, Adrian whispered, pointing toward the end of the corridor. Camilla nodded, remembering what the captain had told her. The air felt colder here. Maybe it was because she knew this was where everything had begun. Adrian leaned closer to the wall. Look at this, he whispered. A small, nearly invisible panel was slightly open near the floor. This is where the camera wires connect. Someone who knew about this could have turned it off easily. Camilla crouched down beside him. She wasn't an expert with technology, but even she could see that the panel looked tampered with. It wasn't broken, but it wasn't as neat as it usually was. Adrian looked at her with a quiet, firm expression. Someone really did set you up. Camilla's chest felt tight, but for the first time in days, she felt something else besides fear. She felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of the truth. They didn't touch anything. They knew better than to disturb evidence. But now they had something real to tell the captain, something more than just words. As they walked back toward their rooms, Camilla felt the weight of everything around her. The palace had always been a place of tradition, of quiet trust. But now she saw it differently. Behind every polished wall, there were secrets waiting in the dark. Adrian walked beside her silently, and for the first time in a long tea, the next morning the palace carried an even heavier air than before. The grand building looked the same as it always did. The tall windows reflected the soft sunlight, the royal gardens were carefully watered, and the sound of the fountain could be heard even from the east wing. But behind that calm surface, everyone felt the growing tension. Every corner of the palace seemed to hold a whisper. The guards moved with quiet alertness. The servants spoke softly, and even the sound of footsteps on the marble floor felt louder. It was as if the palace itself was waiting for something to happen. Camilla woke up before sunrise, her mind too full of thoughts to rest. She sat on the edge of her bed looking out the window. The sky was a pale shade of orange and the morning birds flew above the gardens, free from the worries that weighed on the people inside these walls. She thought about the panel Adrian had found the night before, the one near the storage wing where the camera wires were clearly touched. That small detail had changed everything for her. For the first time since the captain had called her into his office, she felt she had a piece of truth in her hands. Someone had planned this. Someone had turned off the camera on purpose. Adrian entered the room quietly, rubbing his eyes. "You're awake early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," Camilla replied softly. "My mind kept going back to that panel." Adrian nodded, sitting down across from her. "I've been thinking about it too. Whoever did this didn't just take those things on a whim. They planned it. They knew exactly where to go and when," Camilla agreed. "And they knew how to make it look like it was us." The weight of that thought pressed down on both of them. After a few minutes of silence, Adrian said firmly, "We need to tell the captain about what we found." Camilla nodded slowly. "Yes, but we must be careful. If we say something without proof, it can turn against us. But this," she paused, thinking carefully, this is real. He needs to know." By mid-morning, the palace was fully awake. The kitchen staff carried trays of breakfast to different wings. Guards stood straight at their posts. Everything looked orderly from the outside. But behind those polite smiles and carefully timed movements, there was a current of suspicion. Everyone knew the missing items had not yet been found. And everyone also knew that Camilla and her son were at the center of it all. Camilla and Adrian walked through the main corridor together. She could feel people's eyes on her. A maid who used to greet her warmly now only nodded slightly before walking away quickly. 2 butlers lowered their voices as she passed, pretending they weren't talking about her. Adrian clenched his jaw, but Camilla gently touched his arm, silently asking him to stay calm. The captain's office door was slightly open. When they stepped inside, the captain looked up from his desk. His face, as always, was calm, unreadable, and serious. "Camilla." "Adrian," he said with a small nod. "Come in." Camilla sat down while Adrian stood beside her. She spoke slowly, carefully, making sure every word was clear. "Captain, last night we went near the storage wing. We didn't touch anything, but we found something unusual. One of the camera panels was open. The wires looked like someone had tampered with them." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with focus. "You're certain of this?" "Yes," Adrian answered quickly. "We both saw it. It's not broken. It's been opened carefully." The captain leaned back in his chair. He didn't speak right away. For a man who led the royal guard, silence was part of his language. When he finally did speak, his voice was low but firm. "This is important. If the panel was touched, then someone inside the palace did it. Only those who understand the security system would know how." Camilla felt a small flicker of hope. At last the focus might shift away from her and Adrian. "I will have my team examine the panel immediately," the captain continued. "If you're telling the truth, this changes things." Camilla sat a little straighter. "I am telling the truth, Captain. I have nothing to hide." He nodded slowly, still studying her face. "I know, but I must follow every step carefully. Everyone in this palace is under watch right now, not just you. If someone tried to set you up, we will find them." That sentence was like a small beam of light after many days of darkness. The captain sent a team of guards to the storage corridor. For the rest of the morning, quiet movements filled the palace. Guards examined the camera wires, checked records, and reviewed the security logs again. The staff watched them carefully from a distance, whispering even more now. Some whispered about Camilla's possible innocence, others were still unsure. Adrian stayed close to his mother. Every hour felt long. Every look from the people around them felt heavier. By the afternoon, the captain called them back. "Camilla," he said, "you were right. The panel was tampered with. Someone turned off the camera exactly at the time your badge was used. It was done by someone who knew what they were doing." Adrian's heart lifted slightly. "So that means," the captain raised his hand gently, "it means you may not be the ones who did this. But it also means someone inside this palace is guilty. And whoever they are, they were close enough to the security system to know how to control it." Camilla exhaled slowly, the air leaving her chest like a wave. This didn't clear their names completely, but it was a step in the right direction. The captain continued, "We've started questioning other people, but I want you to stay where you are. This is still an active investigation. I'm giving you some space, but understand many eyes are still watching." Camilla nodded calmly. She understood that this was not the end, only a turning point. The following days were a mix of quiet tension and careful movements. The Royal Guard worked silently, asking questions, checking logs, speaking to staff. People whispered even more now. Some felt sorry for Camilla. Some still doubted her. But slowly the way people looked at her began to shift, a little less cold, a little more uncertain. One evening, Clara found Camilla in the garden, the same garden where she had once walked beside the Queen. "I heard the guards found something," Clara whispered. Camilla gave a small nod. "Yes, someone turned off the camera that night." Clara's eyes widened. "Then maybe people will start believing you again." Camilla smiled faintly. "Maybe." As the sun set over the palace, painting the sky in warm gold and orange, Camilla thought about everything that had happened. This was more than just about missing jewels or letters. This was about trust. The Queen had trusted her, and now she had to fight quietly to protect that trust, even when the Queen was no longer here. Meanwhile, Adrian decided not to sit still. He spent time observing small details others overlooked. He spoke casually with a few guards, listened carefully in the corridors, and watched who seemed nervous when security was mentioned. He noticed one thing. The palace's night staff seemed tense, especially one worker who avoided looking at him directly. It might have been nothing, but Adrian had learned one thing from growing up here. When people avoid your eyes, they usually have something to hide. He didn't tell anyone yet. He just watched. Camilla, on the other hand, tried to keep her routine steady. She greeted the staff, walked through the corridors, and kept her head high. She knew every step she took now mattered. She was being observed, not just by the guards, but by everyone. One night, as she walked past the portrait of the Queen in the hallway, she paused. The gentle painted eyes seemed to look right at her, just as they always had. The Queen's words echoed in her memory. "Loyalty is quiet, but it speaks louder than gold." Camilla whispered softly, "I will not let your trust be forgotten." That quiet moment gave her the strength she needed to keep standing. The investigation grew more focused as the week passed. The guards found small clues. Timing differences, door records, movements that didn't match regular routines. Whoever had done this had planned carefully, but not carefully enough to hide forever. One afternoon, the captain called Camilla in again. His expression was firm, but there was something new in his eyes, a hint of respect. "Camilla," he said, "your information about the panel helped us. We're closer to finding out who did this, but this will not be easy. When the truth comes out, everything in this palace will change." Camilla met his gaze steadily. "I just want the truth, Captain." "Nothing else," he nodded slowly. "And you shall have it." Outside his office, Adrian waited. He didn't need to ask what was said. He could see in his mother's eyes that something had shifted. Not everything was fixed yet, but they were no longer standing in the dark alone. As night fell, the palace lights glimmered softly through the windows. Camilla stood by the fountain in the royal garden, watching the water ripple gently. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A small, fragile sense of hope. Adrian joined her, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. "We're going to clear our names," he said. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Yes," she replied. "But the truth is bigger than us now. Whoever did this didn't just steal. They tried to break trust, and trust is what keeps this place standing." The wind carried the sound of the fountain through the night air. The palace remained still, holding its secrets a little longer. But change was coming, and Camilla could feel it, like the soft stirring of air before a storm. The sun rose slowly over the palace, casting soft light across the tall stone walls and the shining golden gates. The air carried the quiet chill of early morning. On any other day, this might have been a peaceful start. But today was different. Everyone in the palace could feel it. Something important was about to happen. The guards moved with a quiet sense of purpose. The staff whispered less and watched more. Camilla stood near the large window of her room, staring at the gardens below. She had been inside these walls for more than half her life. Every corner, every hallway, every flower bed carried a memory, but this morning it all felt unfamiliar, like the palace itself had changed shape. For weeks her life had been turned upside down. Whispers, stares, doubt, investigation. And now, finally, something was about to be revealed. Adrian entered the room quietly, still wearing the same thoughtful expression he had worn every day since the scandal began. He leaned against the doorframe. "You didn't sleep again," he said softly. Camilla didn't turn. No, not a minute. He walked closer and stood beside her. The garden below glistened with morning dew. The palace grounds looked calm, but they both knew the calmness was only on the surface. "Today feels different," Adrian said. Camilla nodded slowly. "Yes, the truth is coming, one way or another." Over the last few days, the royal guard had moved silently but carefully. Questions had been asked. Security footage and door records had been examined again and again. Small details that once seemed unimportant began to build into something clear. A path was forming, a path that led to the real person behind everything. The captain had called for a formal gathering in the Grand Hall that morning. Such meetings were rare, and when they happened, it meant something significant was about to be said. The entire palace staff, from guards to maids to kitchen workers, was expected to be present. Even the royal advisors were coming. For Camilla and Adrian, this day felt like the weight of the past few weeks was pressing down on their shoulders. Their names had been whispered with doubt for so long that it was hard to imagine silence again. When they arrived at the Grand Hall, the sight was overwhelming. The tall chandeliers sparkled in the sunlight, and the long red carpet stretched across the floor like a river. The portraits of past rulers hung on the walls, their painted faces serious, as if they too were waiting to hear what would happen. People gathered quietly, taking their places. Guards lined the walls. The staff stood in groups exchanging nervous glances. No one dared to speak loudly. Camilla and Adrian stood toward the back of the room. They didn't try to be in the center. For weeks they had already been at the center of everyone's attention, not out of choice but out of suspicion. When the captain entered the hall, the quiet became complete. His steps were measured and calm. He carried no papers, no folders, just his steady presence. He stood at the front of the room facing everyone. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that carried easily through the large hall. For weeks, this palace has lived under a cloud of suspicion. A piece of the late queen's legacy went missing. Trust was shaken. Questions were raised, and people's names were whispered in corners. Camilla lowered her eyes slightly. She could feel the weight of those words. The captain continued. "The royal guard has worked carefully to uncover the truth. We reviewed every movement, every door log, every small detail, and this morning I can tell you that we have found the person responsible." A ripple went through the crowd. People exchanged quiet looks. Some even took small steps forward, eager to hear more. The captain looked around the room, his gaze steady. It was not Camilla. It was not Adrian. The whispering grew louder. Some people looked surprised. Others simply exhaled, as if holding their breath all these weeks had finally become too much. Camilla closed her eyes for a second. She didn't cry, but the feeling inside her was heavy. It wasn't joy exactly. It was more like relief that carried both weight and lightness at the same time. The captain went on. "Someone inside this palace carefully planned to remove the queen's belongings. They turned off the security cameras. They used Camilla's badge without her knowledge. They tried to hide their tracks. But the truth always leaves footprints." He explained how they found fingerprints on the panel, how certain shifts didn't match their reports, how a single mistake had led to the real culprit. It turned out to be someone from the night security team, a person who had worked quietly and gone mostly unnoticed over the years. The person had already been brought into custody earlier that morning. The stolen items were recovered from a safe location outside the palace. Nothing had been sold yet. Camilla listened to every word carefully. She didn't look at the crowd, even though she could feel many pairs of eyes turning toward her. The whispers that had once carried her name now carried something else. Surprise, maybe even guilt. The captain ended his speech with clear, firm words. "Camilla and Adrian were never guilty. Their names are cleared. They remain part of this palace's trusted circle." The room was silent for a moment. Then came the quiet sounds of people shifting, whispering, sighing. The tone of those whispers was different now. Not sharp. Not suspicious. Softer. Clara, the maid who had stood by Camilla in quiet support, was the first to step forward. She approached her with a gentle smile and said softly, "I knew it wasn't you." Camilla gave a small nod. She didn't have many words. The feeling of being believed again was something she couldn't describe easily. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, warm, and steady. Adrian stood beside her, his head held high. For weeks he had felt the weight of being seen as guilty. Now, for the first time, that weight was lifting. But even as relief settled in, Camilla knew something else. The memory of those weeks would not vanish overnight. People would remember. Trust once broken doesn't come back all at once. It grows slowly again, like sunlight returning after a storm. Later that day, Camilla walked through the palace hallways. This time, when people looked at her, their eyes were softer. Some even smiled a little. It wasn't the same as before, but it was a beginning. She stopped in front of the Queen's portrait. The gentle face in the painting seemed to watch her with the same calm expression it always had. Camilla whispered softly, "I kept my promise. I stayed loyal." Adrian joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea from the kitchen. "You look different," he said, handing her one. She smiled faintly. "I feel different." They sat quietly on the bench near the garden, sipping their tea as the fountain splashed gently in the background. For the first time in weeks, their hearts felt lighter. The royal guard continued their work. The culprit would face the proper consequences according to the law, and the Queen's belongings would be returned to their rightful place. But for Camilla and Adrian, the story was more personal. In the weeks that followed, the whispers around the palace slowly faded. People began to speak to Camilla like they once had. The trust she had built over decades began to return piece by piece. She didn't hold anger in her heart for those who had doubted her. She understood that fear makes people believe what they hear most easily. She chose not to let bitterness live inside her. One afternoon, Clara said to her quietly, "You carried yourself with grace through all of this." Not everyone could have done that, Camilla simply smiled. She knew that strength wasn't about shouting or fighting loudly. It was about standing tall even when the world doubted you. Adrian, too, changed through the experience. The playful, carefree boy who had once only noticed the beauty of the palace now saw its shadows, too. He had learned how fragile trust could be, how quickly things could change. But he had also learned something more powerful, how strong the truth could be. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall palace walls, Adrian stood beside his mother, looking out at the gardens. "Do you ever wish we could just leave all this behind?" he asked softly. Camilla thought for a moment. "No," she said finally. "This place has given us both pain and love, but it's part of who we are. And sometimes you must stay to protect the things that matter, not because it's easy, but because it's right." The fountain sparkled under the orange sky. The air was calm. For the first time in a long time, the palace felt like home again. The scandal that had once cast a shadow over Camilla and Adrian's lives slowly became a story people whispered less and less. And one day it would no longer be whispered at all. Camilla would always carry the memory of those difficult weeks, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how strong the truth truly is. And as she walked through the palace halls, she held her head high, knowing she had faced the storm and remained unshaken.